Hello and welcome to Tower Talk, vital conversations from Prospect Park United Methodist Church in Minneapolis. I'm Dave Nyberg. These programs are designed to take an in-depth look at some of the issues of the day through the lens of members of the Prospect Park United Methodist congregation and members from the community at large. Our guest in this edition of Tower Talk is Liz Richards. Liz is the Executive Director of Violence Free Minnesota. Liz, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Great to have you here, Liz. First, I guess right up front, could you give us an overview of the work that Violence Free Minnesota does across the state of Minnesota?
Absolutely. Violence Free Minnesota is a statewide coalition that works on intimate partner violence. So we have 93 member programs who are providing advocacy and services to domestic and sexual violence victims and their families throughout the state of Minnesota. And so we at the state coalition provide support to those programs. We also work on statewide public policy to improve those public policies around domestic and sexual violence issues. We work on awareness campaigns and just really work with anybody who is working with the victims of domestic and sexual violence to support their work.
Liz, the name of the organization has changed over the past couple of years. It used to be known as the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. Why the name change?
Well, the name change was for a number of reasons, and really essentially to reflect the transformation in the work. The coalition was founded in 1978 under the name Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women. And the way in which the work is being thought about and done has evolved. And the other thing is Violence Free Minnesota. It's our vision, it's what we're working for, and is a much more encompassing name really for the work that we're doing at this point.
Kind of in that vein, how do you define violence? I mean, does the organization have a way that it wraps it into a specific definition or general definition?
Right, and so I'm both going to tell you what we define as violence and what we don't define as our areas. We really focus specifically on what we call intimate partner violence. So it's violence committed by a spouse, a former spouse, a dating partner against their partner, right? And that's violence could be physical violence, it could be sexual violence. It's also emotional, psychological violence. We oftentimes talk about it's a system of behaviors and tactics to exact power and control over a partner. And so that includes lots of different things. What it doesn't include is things like child abuse, other kinds of abuse that may happen in a family setting. While there's a lot of intersection and interrelatedness, it's not really our area of expertise. So our area of expertise is really intimate partner violence. There's a high overlap and correlation, and we do a lot of partnership work with other areas of people working in violence. But our specialty, sort of what we know best and work most directly on, is intimate partner violence.
Liz, describe a little bit about the impact of violence in our society and on our society, both from an individual perspective and also from a societal perspective.
Well, I mean, I think the individual is the most obvious and what people think about most directly. So just, what does it mean to be living in a home, a place where we oftentimes talk about homes as our sanctuaries, our places of refuge. So what does it mean if the place, your home is someplace where you aren't safe, right? And so what's the impact on individuals, both when they're experiencing direct violence and when they're not necessarily experiencing it right now, but there's the anticipation of when something could be turning violent. So it has a daily constant impact on those who live with violence. And it also has a societal impact. So and you can talk about it in very sort of concrete, measurable terms. So if you're a business and you have employees who are experiencing violence at home, how are they going to show up at work to be their full selves, sure. Right? We also say, like, for children experiencing violence in the home, they're living in a home where there's violence. How do they show up at work ready to learn? I mean, at school ready to learn, right? Much less, what are the costs the cost in terms of, medical care, and in cost of lost productivity and lost work hours. But I also would like to think that societally, to know that we have a significant portion of people who live in our communities who live with this daily trauma and can't live up to their full potentials, that has an impact on all of us, and has an impact on the way we function as a society.
Liz, who are the most vulnerable when it comes to violence and domestic violence?
Well, I would answer that in two different ways. First, I would say that in terms of who's vulnerable for violence, it's everybody, right? That we see the victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. It could be anybody. I mean, I oftentimes think, it's a matter of luck that somebody isn't a victim of violence. But who's most vulnerable? We oftentimes talk in terms of who's most marginalized. Those most marginalized are most vulnerable, in part because for the same reasons they're marginalized, it means they're the easiest folks to become victimized and who have the greatest barriers to be able to address it. For instance, you have somebody who's an immigrant who is here and maybe undocumented, right? The tools that somebody can use to victimize them, to use violence against them, are greater, right? So somebody who is undocumented is much less likely to call for outside assistance,
sure,
knowing that I might not just get the violence stopped, but it may land me into deportation, right? Much less, most immigrants are not able to access economic resources to help them change their living situation. So they don't qualify for a lot of benefits and relief. So we always say, who's most marginalized in our communities? Those are the people most vulnerable.
But an interesting, one of the areas of abuse and violence that your organization deals with is financial abuse. Talk a little bit about that and what exactly that means.
Well, when I said that the way in which violence plays out is that we really talk about it's a system of behaviors and tactics to gain and maintain power and control over somebody else. And economic violence, economic control is one of those ways to do that. And there have been repeated studies done and that with victims who have experienced physical violence, and almost to a person, they will also talk about there were elements of economic control that happened in their situation. So it's everything from people, talk to people in relationships where they're given a weekly allowance, right? And this is the only money they have access to. They may have no other access to the family finances. It could be, even people who are out working, right? That they may be the partner who's out with gainful employment, that oftentimes will see that they turn their check over and are, really sort of required, or there are consequences to turning control of that money over. So just not having the access to those resources.
In terms of the work that the organization has done over the years, how has it changed? Has the face of violence changed over the years?
Well, I mean, there have been a number of changes, and I think that part of it has been both an understanding of what's going on and also some real complexities with what's happening. When this work first started back in the 1970s, that the real focus was on how do we try and create some safe spaces. I mean, back in the 1970s, it wasn't considered illegal to extract violence against your partner, right? And so there was really no resource, there's nothing you could do short about trying to figure it out on your own. So a lot of the work initially focused on, can we create safe spaces? So safe houses, sheltering, that kind of approach. And there was a really heavy focus, and there was an intentional decision made to really see domestic and sexual violence as a crime, and to look at the criminal legal system as the responder to violence happening within the home. Big shift since then, and part of it is really looking now about looking at the criminal justice system as a primary, if not a sole responder to violence in the home was a big mistake. That, that we need a whole array of responses to what's going on in the home. So that's on the response side of stuff.
Sure.
We're also seeing a lot more complexity in terms of what people are dealing with. That when I talk to our providers across the state, everyone is struggling with how do we deal with the mental health issues of the people coming into our programs? How do we deal with chemical dependency issues coming into our programs? With the economic issues, with immigration issues. I mean, there's these compounding issues in people's lives that either, I think there's more complexity to that, that there are a lot less safety resources out there for people. So oftentimes I'll talk to programs in some smaller communities around the state, and they're like the only really social service program in town anymore.
Right.
And so they're dealing with whatever walks through the door without a lot of other help. And so it's a lot more complex what we're seeing in terms of who we're working with, and our understanding has really sort of shifted and changed.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you was rural versus urban violence, as it were. You know, you just mentioned one of the differences between the two, and how families and individuals deal with it. Can you expand a little bit further? Are there substantive differences between Greater Minnesota and when you get into the Twin Cities in terms of the kind of work that your organization does and what you're faced with each day?
Yeah, I mean, there's both differences and similarities. I mean, one of the things that we do is we track domestic violence homicide cases in the state. We're the only entity in the state that does that. And so we've been doing it for going on 32 years now. And one of the things that there's sort of a notion out there that most, you know, violence is happening in the metro area. It doesn't happen around the state. You know, that's where we're seeing homicides, right? Yeah. And if you look at domestic violence homicides, it's not true. That about 50% of our homicides happen outside of the metro area when you look at domestic violence.
50%?
So, yeah, so it's a really different profile than when you look at, you know, like if you look at gun violence or you look at homicide rates in total, it's a very different profile. But if you look at domestic violence homicide, it happens across the state, right? So in that way, there isn't a distinction. But part of it is that there's a real difference in terms of localities, and it's both, you know, the blessing and the curse of, you know, this work, which is when you live in small communities, right? There are problems like, you know, everybody knows everybody. And what right. is that, you know, it both creates opportunities and it creates barriers, right? So, you know, it's in some ways it's easier to get your program known, know that you exist out there. In other ways, it's much harder for people, you know, like what does it mean if I reach out for services, you know? And so confidentiality is a really key cornerstone to the work that we do, that, you know, who we work with and what we do with folks is really held very close and kept very confidential for those very reasons. The other thing that we find is that the resources vary so differently. And I think like right now during COVID, where everything is going online, we have parts of the state where there's very bad internet access, right?
Right.
And so what's the increased isolation that's going on? What's the ability to reach out for services when we've kind of moved to an online way of communicating and interacting with each other? So there's some real barriers in some parts of the state. So those are some of the differences.
Are there other ways, speaking of COVID-19 and the pandemic, are there other ways that the pandemic has impacted, say, the degree of cases you're seeing or the number of cases? How has that impacted your scope of work?
Yeah, one of the things is that, you know, when Governor Walz first put in place his stay-at-home orders and executive orders, our services were deemed essential services. So our programs have been working without interruption, essentially. But there's been some real challenges because our programs have also, where they can, gone to remote work, and where they can't, have tried to put in the best physical distancing practices that they can to really make our services as safe as possible. And one of the things that we've been seeing is right after the governor's stay-at-home order went into place, for the first weeks after that, we have a statewide crisis line, the day one crisis line number, and their call volume went up about a little over 25% over what it was a year ago, right? Now, we also have, all of our programs have local crisis line numbers. So they also answer their phones 24 hours a day. So it's not quite clear what all was happening around the state. We don't have that kind of data. But we did hear things like from law enforcement that they were seeing an increase in domestic violence calls, and that the calls they were getting, there was a higher level of severity on those calls. We've also been hearing the same sort of things from our programs around the state, that while some of our programs report a real drop off in people calling their programs, what they have found is that those who do call them said that it was a struggle for them to find a space where they could actually have privacy to make a phone call.
Right.
We've also been hearing that there are higher levels of severity in terms of people are calling in not necessarily just because I want to talk to you and get some support, but people are calling in because there's active violence and fairly high levels of violence going on in the home.
Liz, how does Minnesota compare to other states in terms of dealing with this kind of violence, this violence in the home?
Well, there's a network of domestic violence providers throughout the entire country and the territories. And so every state has at least a domestic or domestic and sexual violence coalition, right, and a network of providers. I would say that Minnesota has more programming available than almost any other state per capita. And we have a greater diversity of types of programming doing this work than any other state. And part of that is because we as a state were early in terms of taking on this work, and we really have been leaders in a lot of this work nationally since the 1970s. And we also have a state that has invested, the government has invested in this programming, and that's not true across the country.
We have seen so much violence here locally on a region-wide basis, and the tragedy of the killing of George Floyd, and the subsequent violence surrounding what's taken place in our community. Have you seen that have an impact on the work, or the expanding cases that you're having to deal with?
Well, I'm going to take a step back. And one of the things when you ask me about our definition of violence, right, I mean, it's a huge question in our field.
Yeah.
Yeah, we like to define things and put together charts and graphics. But one of the things that we talk about is, when I talk about intimate partner violence being a system where there are tactics of power and control, so we really talk about oppression as being core to what's going on. And so that really we talk about our work as being not just anti-violence work, but anti-oppression work. And that the oppression that happens within intimate partner violence is absolutely linked to other oppressions. So racial, racism, classism, these are all linked issues. And so we see the oversection and the intersectionality between the work that we do and the work of racial equality. And just like when we talked about who's most vulnerable, who's most marginalized, that's also true in terms of racial disparities. So we see the impact of intimate partner violence playing out in much more severe ways in Black and Brown communities. It just is the reality. And so when you look at the violence, and I would also say, violence, the same sort of traumas that come with intimate partner violence is the same, racial discrimination and, violence based on race, and what I would call state-sanctioned violence, which is violence by law enforcement. These are all compounding traumas that people experience. So for us, we very much see the intersectionality, and we see that, and we work very much about how do we advance racial equality in the work that we do, because we know that this is linked. That if we only work on, and I don't know how we would do it, just on intimate partner violence and don't address racial inequalities, then we aren't going to be successful. That these are linked, and we must work on these jointly. The other thing is, when I said that we invested early on in the strategy of criminal justice system response as a primary response to violence, and that's something that we are working to change now. Mm-hmm. So, particularly for those, for most people who pick up the phone and call 911, they aren't necessarily looking for their partner to be arrested and prosecuted and put into jail. What most people want when they pick up the phone and call 911, they want the violence to stop, right? And they don't have the ability to get that violence to stop on their own, and they need help, right? And what we've given them is their primary response is to call 911. And so for a lot of people, it's like, I wanted the violence to stop. I didn't necessarily, I certainly didn't want my partner to be beat up or killed by law enforcement. A lot of people don't even want their partner to be in jail, because we know what happens is once you have a conviction on your record, what's your ability to be able to earn money? What's your ability to be able to find housing, right? And what's the impact on a family to take one of the adults and place them into categories in which they cannot economically support their own family, right? So what are those consequences? Now, I'm not saying that that's everybody, but that's a lot of folks, and it clearly plays out disparately with Black and Brown communities, right? So the same disparities that exist in the criminal justice system then have a disparate impact even in domestic violence criminal activity, right? Yeah. But one of the things that we're looking at right now is how do we go from having criminal legal system response being the primary response to saying it's a last response. So what would it look like for us to create alternatives? So what would it look like if I knew I could turn to these 3 or 5 or 10 other response systems to help stop the violence going on in my life, and that my only choice was not to pick up the phone and call 911, right? So that's, that there may be, and there are times in which law enforcement intervention is the correct response. But we have not created a system that has sort of a smorgasbord of opportunities so that I can choose what's right for me in terms of getting a response to the violence in my life.
That sounds like a huge task. And I would assume that part of the work that you're doing, maybe a large part of the work that you're doing, is to I was going to asking about changing the dialogue, but it's more than changing the dialogue. It's changing all the systemic approaches or the system approaches to violence. And I would imagine you see yourself as being right smack dab in the middle of that and helping to change those approaches to how violence is treated from a societal standpoint.
Oh, absolutely. And so, and I'm going to say, what are some of those things? So,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so part of it is, there's both looking internally about how we do our own work, and there's looking externally about how we think other systems should be doing their work. And internally, one of the things that is that listening very much to leaders within the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities that are working in my field, and really listening carefully and thoughtfully to their thoughts, and really saying, what changes do you see? What needs to be happening here? And uplifting those things and putting that at the core of how we do our work. Mm-hmm. So really trying to shift very intentionally how we're doing our work internally. Externally, there's a lot, and there are plenty of conversations going on, and I know, so one of the things is that we're very much supporting the reallocation of funding. We need to move some of the funding out of the criminal legal system and true investments into community-based solutions, right? That people cannot do this work without the funding to support it. So, so for one thing is that we have programming that works with perpetrators of violence. We call it domestic abuse transformation programming. How do we change somebody's behavior who has been using violence in the relationship and transform them, right? That's how we're going to stop violence, right? We can't just respond after it happens. We have to actually change the way and transform people's behaviors.
Right.
So we have this programming happening around the state. The government does not fund any of this work. So we've been asking for a number of years for them to invest in this programming, which we show is effective, right? So we have an alternative to jails and prisons, right? And then we need to keep growing those kinds of programmings out in our communities. So for instance, like what's going on in our schools? You know, schools don't just deal with children, they deal with full families, right? So when kids, you know, and they're doing their pre-K, ready for school, they do their hearing and vision testing, like, why aren't they asking about issues of violence within the home? I mean, it's much more complicated than that than just asking this question. But we know what the impact is on children for living in homes where there's violence. And then unless you address that, you really don't have kids who are fully ready to learn. So just like if they have a vision problem, we need to address that so they can be ready to learn, right? But we don't have a school system that really sees that as being in their scope.
Right.
So those are the kinds of changes that we're working on, both in terms of shifting funding out of the criminal legal system, but also getting a much wider, deeper involvement across other sectors.
That plays into one of my final questions, Liz. So what can the quote unquote average citizen do to be a part of the work that you're doing and to help support the work that you're doing?
Well, hopefully, you know, I kind of put this in kind of three different buckets, right? So the first is really just learning, right? There's lots of information out there about what's going on with domestic and sexual violence. What's the intersection? You know, one thing is that we have, you know, a Facebook social media presence where we really try and post stuff to really help people think and think critically about these issues. And there's lots of other places where you can actually learn. So the first thing is just getting educated, you know, to really understand more about domestic and sexual violence and kind of what's happening and where are places you can plug in. The second thing I always talk to people about is connect. There are lots of opportunities at a local level. I tell you, we have 93 member programs across the state. They all rely very heavily on the use of volunteers to be able to do their work, right? And volunteers can be everything from, you know, we need, you know, people to help provide childcare while we're doing X, Y, and Z with their parents, to, you know, helping us right now. I mean, most of our programs are having people sew them face masks so that they can safely provide services within their programs. So there's a whole range of volunteer opportunities with any local program. And you can actually find all those local programs through our website. They're all listed there. And then the last thing I always tell people to do is where are you connected in your life, right? If, you know, so we all have different roles we play, right? So I'm a parent, right? I might work in the medical profession, right? So what is your world? And then what can be done within that arena to sort of start to address what's going on? And so one of the things, I know we're having this conversation from Prospect Park United Methodist Church, right? So what does that mean? And I think it's a really good question because the faith communities have oftentimes been used as instruments of abuse in relationships, right? And so I think that there is a, you know, a special obligation that faith communities have to change that narrative and to become places where they're of real learning and places of real refuge. And it's both for people who are experiencing violence. And I also think we have an obligation about how do we talk to people who we know are engaging in behaviors that are not okay in their relationship, right? And it seems like the perfect place to sort of lovingly embrace people and hold them accountable for bad behaviors. And so there are roles to be played in wherever you show up. So I say, learn about it, connect with local programs to support them, And then in whatever arena you're working in, think about what you can actually do in that space.
That is a great call to action, Liz. And I think a great place to end the conversation for today. And hopefully we will have an opportunity for follow-ups down the road. Liz, you've been so gracious with your time. Thank you so much, and we appreciate you being on this initial edition of Tower Talk.
No, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Liz Richards, the Executive Director of Violence Free Minnesota, joining us on Tower Talk. You can find all episodes of Tower Talk on the Prospect Park United Methodist Church website at prospectparkchurch.org. You can also sign up to be on the Prospect Park UMC mailing list at that same website. And you can email us at prospectparkumc@gmail.com. And my thanks to the Tower Talk production team, to Angela, AK, Pastor Chris, and all those who've been a part of the program. Liz, thank you again.
Absolutely.
I'm Dave Nyberg. We'll see you next time on Tower Talk.